Damaged Defenders by Scherzam. Chapter 2. Bruce and Thor. Bruce had always known he'd be living free on borrowed time. He'd always known someone would try to nab him. Again. So he'd barely even blinked at Romanov's appearance. He'd even expected to be lied to and double-crossed, so the existence of the squad of men hadn't been anything like a surprise. But just because he'd expected it didn't mean the other guy hadn't been growling, grumbling, and itching to get out more than usual ever since Romanov showed up. It was taking every calming technique Bruce knew to keep the other guy from breaking free just from the sheer stress of the situation, never mind the fact he felt about as safe as a mouse at a Ronin Hunters convention. He weathered the suspicions, wary standoffishness of everyone around him, and their tendency to reach for their weapons when he got too close, or looked anything but meek. It was nothing more than what he'd come to expect from people who knew what he really was and what the other guy was capable of. Which had made Tony Stark so startling. The man had breezed into the room like he hadn't a care in the world, and had proceeded right up to Bruce, chattering happily, and without so much as the faintest hint of hesitance, never mind fear. If it hadn't been for the rage monster comment, Bruce would have wondered if Tony knew about the other guy to be so nonchalant. Now he was just wondering about the man's sanity, and trying not to ache for Betty too much because Tony was reminding him a lot of her. Even though he'd been at the back end of nowhere for the last couple years, he knew of Tony, and had heard about the changes Tony had made in his company. He'd expected the man to be eccentric and pretty much a waste of air, that someone in the company had actually been the one to build the things Stark Industries churned out, and Tony was just taking credit for it. Tony was anything but that. Bruce, for the first time, found himself struggling to keep up with someone else's intellect, and he was adoring every minute of it. More interestingly, the other guy had begun to back off a bit. Bruce wasn't sure if it was the fact Tony reminded him so much of Betty that was doing it or what, but the other guy was clearly not tracking Tony as a threat. Not even the poke in the side made the other guy get restless. They spent a companionable half hour or so scanning the stick, then calibrating to search for the Tesseract. At that point, Tony started monkeying around with the helicarrier's computer system, clearly searching for something even as they talked. Inevitably, the other guy came up in conversation. Bruce found himself admitting to something he'd never really told anyone, even Betty. How raw and exposed he felt had always been his secret. She'd known he didn't like it, of course, but she hadn't known the full extent. Tony's attempt to convince him that the other guy could be a good thing had been unexpectedly touching. He'd heard that sort of argument before, of course, but never from the angle Tony approached it from. Bruce had only really ever heard about how the other guy could be an asset to the military if properly focused. Bruce didn't really believe Tony was right, but it was nice to hear. Steve stopped by right about the time Tony poked him, and Bruce sighed mentally at Steve's immediate concern. For God's sake, he was not that fragile. If he was, he'd never have come anywhere near this place except in chains, which would have been an epically bad idea on the part of anyone trying to get him into chains. Tony didn't seem to like Steve very much, which made Bruce wonder what the deal was there. At any rate, Tony managed to chase Steve out, and they went back to their work. They were interrupted again shortly after that by Fury, who was displeased that Tony had somehow hacked into the helicarrier's computers. Steve showed up about the same time, carrying a big, awkward-looking gun, and there was a bit of an angry discussion before Fury turned and stalked out. Steve gave them both considering looks, then nodded and left as well. About 5 minutes later, out of nowhere, the room exploded. Bruce barely even felt his landing and took no real notice of his surroundings once he hit, because he was already fighting like a madman to keep the other guy at bay. The other guy was raging, howling to be freed, fighting Bruce's control with everything it had. And then, to his complete horror, he heard Tony's voice. Worse, Tony's voice close by. Bruce redoubled his efforts to get control of the other guy, terrified it'd kill Tony if it got out. It took him a minute or two to make sense of what Tony was saying. Which is when he realized Tony was cracking jokes. Horrible, groan-worthy, ancient science jokes that Bruce more or less had to laugh at in sheer self-defense. They were that bad. And incredibly, the other guy began to recede. When he was finally back in complete control, he discovered he was sprawled on the floor amidst the wreckage of the lab, only a floor down. He was more than slightly sweaty and shaky from the effort to keep the other guy from coming out, and Tony was crouched a few feet away, looking supremely unconcerned for a man who'd come to within a hair's breadth of meeting the other guy. "You back with me, Brucey?" Tony wanted to know. "Yeah," Bruce said. Thanks," he said, not quite sure what else to say. "Not a problem. Listen, you hang out here, okay? I need to go help kick ass," Tony said, then handed Bruce something. "Communicator. It only goes to my suit, so you won't be accidentally hearing what else is going on. You start feeling growly again, give me a yell. I can tell jokes all day." Bruce gave Tony a stunned look, then gave him a hesitant smile. "Thank you," he said quietly. Tony nodded and took off. Bruce put the communicator in his ear, incredibly grateful that he'd have help keeping control while things were getting violent, because letting the other guy out up here would be incredibly bad. Thor had little to do while the Midgardians looked for the Tesseract, so he opted to spend time by the cage Loki had been placed in. It gave him time to think. He had begun to learn a lesson the last time he'd been here on Midgard. He wasn't quite sure it was the lesson Odin had wanted him to learn, though. Oh, to be sure, he had begun to learn restraint and foresight, rather than rushing into battle blindly and with no thought to the consequences. But he had begun to learn other things as well. Things like thinking for himself and not obeying blindly. Like not automatically assuming that Odin was infallible. Thor had spent much of the last year going over his childhood in his mind and had finally realized that there had been things amiss as far back as he could remember where Loki had been concerned. Things Odin had said, had done, or had encouraged. Things his friends had said, done, and encouraged. And worst, things he had said and done and encouraged. Thor had begun to understand why Loki had gone so far astray when Thor had been banished. The true miracle was that it had not happened before now. Thor had been troubled by how little many in Asgard had mourned the loss of their youngest prince. Thor had taken to spending more and more time with his mother, one of the few in the realm who truly mourned Loki's death. They had become much closer as a result, not that they'd ever been estranged. And then Odin had revealed that Loki was alive and headed to Earth. Thor's first thought had been to wonder just how long Odin had known Loki was alive. His second had been incredible gratitude that Loki was alive. His third had been a grim determination to save his brother and protect him. He'd had little hope it would work, at least at first. Now, knowing that Loki might well be being controlled, hope for Loki's salvation was restored. He was still chiding himself for his rather severe lapse in control earlier. He still did not entirely understand what had possessed him to try to smash Captain Rogers so. He'd had no idea the mortal's shield was so formidable. By all rights, the mortal ought to have been smashed to bits, which would have been very poorly done of him, especially since the man had only asked him to put his hammer down and talk peaceably. Evidently, he still had much to learn still when it came to restraint and foresight. Loki seemed content to keep his silence, yet further proof he was not himself. Under any other circumstances, he would have had something to say about Thor hanging about the way he was. Thor had actually almost dozed off when the flying machine they rode in shook like horse ridding its coat of water. There was a near instant scramble from the Midgardians, and Thor quickly realized that there was some threat afoot, possibly Loki's mind-controlled cohorts. Thor started to grab his hammer, then stopped himself. These were mortals. The ones called Stark and Banner aside, none of them had the strength or armor to deflect a blow from Mjolnir. To strike any of them would be to kill them. His fists would be weapon enough. He left Mjolnir sitting by Loki's cage and hurried off to assist in the defense. You could hear someone, a female by the tenor of the voice, speaking, alerting everyone as to the flying machine's status and the whereabouts of the attackers. As he did not know the layout of the machine, he mostly ignored her announcements and followed his ears to where the battle was being fought. The attackers knew what they were about. Though Thor managed to take the first by surprise, thanks to coming up on him from behind, the man got over the surprise quickly enough and proved to be an able combatant. Thor well remembered the running battle he had engaged in last time he'd been on Midgard, and this man was of equal or greater skill to the men he'd had to fight then. It was a bit easier this time, as he was not stripped of his powers. But not by much. He'd left the first man behind, knocked unconscious and sprawled on the floor, and had begun to contend with the second when the flying machine unexpectedly started to tilt, throwing him off his feet and sending both him and his opponent tumbling into one of the nearby walls. Thor managed to recover himself first and was able to knock the second man out before he regained his feet. Thor made his way forward with a bit more difficulty now that the machine was tilted, seeking any other opponents. He heard Director Fury's voice saying something about someone named Barton, then Agent Romanov, answering him. About a minute later, the machine righted itself, and within moments of that, Agent Romanov's voice sounded again, saying she had Barton in custody, and he seemed to be himself again. A minute or two later, it was determined that all their opponents had been subdued. Fury told them to head for the conference room. Thor immediately made his way there, wondering if Agent Romanov was correct and that Barton was himself. If he was one of the ones that had been controlled, that would mean there might be a feasible way to return Loki to himself.